Hello and welcome back to the Trinity Student Managed Fund podcast with me, Emanuele Roncalli di Montorio-Veronese, where I speak with leaders in the world of business, finance and technology to give our students a better insight into the careers we may wish to pursue. Today's episode is sponsored by SEDA Asset Management, a Dublin-based boutique investment manager specialising in equity and multi-asset strategies with a fundamental value approach since 1998. With a proven track record of strong performance and 13.2 billion euros in active assets under management, SEDA serves a diverse client base, including institutional insurance, pension funds, charities and family offices across Ireland, Germany, Canada and the United States, applying a long-term investment philosophy that clients value. Today, I sit down with Dr. Mark Calabria, who is the former director of the Federal Housing Finance Agency, also known as the FHFA, which regulates and supervises Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and the federal home loan banks. During his tenure at the agency, Dr. Calabria led the response to COVID-19 as well as laid the groundwork for a removal of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac from government conservatorship. Prior to his heading of the FHFA, Dr. Calabria served as chief economist to Vice President Pence. In that role, he led the Vice President's work on taxes, trade, labour, financial services, manufacturing and general economic issues, including serving as a key member of the team that enacted the Tax and Jobs Act of 2017 and on the team that crafted the United States-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. Dr. Calabria served as the Vice President's primary representative for the US-Japan Economic Dialogue. Dr. Calabria also served as a senior AD to the US Senate Committee on Banking, Housing and Urban Affairs under chairs Richard Shelby and Phil Gramm. During his Senate service, he acted as the primary drafter of the Housing and Economic Recovery Act of 2008, which established a stronger regulatory framework for the government-sponsored housing enterprises. He also led the Banking Committee's response to Hurricane Katrina, as well as its work on the Shelby-Dodd Flood Insurance Reform and Modernization Act of 2008, which served as the basis for the Biggert Waters Flood Insurance Reform Act of 2012. Prior to his Senate service, Dr. Calabria served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Regulatory Affairs in the Office of Housing at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Dr. Calabria has also held positions with Harvard University's Joint Center for Housing Studies, the National Association of Realtors, and the National Association of Home Builders. Dr. Calabria holds a doctorate in economics from George Mason University. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Dr. Mark Calabria. All right, so welcome back to the Trinity Student Managed Fund podcast, and I'm very excited to welcome Dr. Mark Calabria. So welcome.
That's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So, Mark, I've been watching your interviews going back quite a few years, all the way back to sort of 2010, 2011. And it's sort of all the interviews, we hear about your views on the economy, on the housing market, but I'd love to start on a more personal note. And I saw on your X, you posted a picture of a Calabrian limoncino. So I'd love to know kind of what are your roots to Europe? Your last name is Calabria. Could you tell us more about sort of your personal life?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So, my grandfather came over in 1923, and was from Calabria. Met, my grandmother, who here in the States, she grew up outside of Naples. And I will say on my grandmother's side, her mother was actually named Medici, and I have a little bit of Medici blood, as I'm sure probably about a fourth of Italy does. This is my guess. Maybe that's always been somewhat my interest in financial services, is going back to the Medici side of the family. And so I've always taken a deep interest in Italy. My grandfather grew up in a little town on the Ionian coast of Calabria called Bianco, and had a chance to go there last year for the first time, and really was just a special trip for me. And I always feel so at home in southern Italy. Of course, I'm the first to say, you got to go to Rome and Venice and see the north. But if you haven't seen the south of Italy, spent my birthday 2 years ago in Agrigento, just hiking the ruins. And again, so it's some of my favorite places in the world. Now, my mother's side of the family are all Irish Welsh, so there's a little bit of difference, but only in America can you kind of see these cross connections. In fact, I would say, even on my father's side, although both my grandparents are Italian, my grandmother came from what you would probably say much higher social class than my grandfather, and I assume they probably never would have married in Italy. And so again, it gets to that degree of America just being such a great melting pot of both class and culture from Europe, but very much see my roots in Europe and take a great interest. Um, Maybe this says a lot about how lucky I've been in my career and also in Italy. But in my 2 years at the White House in 2017 and 2018, one of the funnest things that I got to do was greet two different Italian prime ministers. Two years.
And I didn't know, I
Um,
didn't know that either as well. So you have a link to, do you have a link to Ireland as well?
Wow, yes, yes, for on my mother's side. I have done a little less research on that side. But again, and that's, it's certainly quite common in the US, although it goes much further back. My mother's relatives, I'm not going to quite say the Mayflower. It's not, that wouldn't be the case, but not long thereafter, they have been, she's from North Carolina, and you have a very strong kind of Irish, well, some Scottish community that goes back hundreds of years, and so that's a much longer community where it's fascinating. I mean, I've been able to actually trace the ship that I know the day and the ship and the port my grandfather came over on, and the ability at Ellis Island they've really digitized all of the manifests, and I was actually even able to track down a picture of the ship my grandfather came on 100 years ago. So that was pretty exciting to me. And imagine, of course, when I go to Europe, I fly. So imagine taking a boat, getting on a ship in Naples, Italy, and coming across the Atlantic. So it certainly, I really always try to keep in mind, the sacrifices that people made to get me where I am today. And also, and it's also kind of a mixed. I remember as a growing up, I'd occasionally ask my grandmother if she missed Italy, and she would basically say, "No, not at all. We were dirt poor." I was glad she was glad to leave. My grandfather, however, had a lot more nostalgia for Italy, but again, it really just is that coming across and creating opportunity here, and that's why one of my deep love, like I mean, pretty much all Americans were fundamentally from somewhere else, and have just such a deep love of having the opportunities we've been able to have in this country. The reality is, we would have not had those opportunities back in our home countries or in our ancestry elsewhere. So I'm at one time obviously a very big booster for the United States, and a big booster and a lot of affection for Europe, and therefore perhaps want to poke and prod my European friends to perhaps be more competitive and open and grow their economies, and be a force in the world, and be a partner in the world in the way that I know that they have been and are capable of being.
Absolutely. I mean, that echoes the Draghi report recently.
Absolutely, and it's and so I certainly will say it's I guess like anybody who follows Italian politics, and I only follow at a very high level, but you have this mixture of hope and frustration, because you know what Italy can be, and but the frustration of getting there, and kind of making the advances, and nudging the country toward the reforms that it needs to have. I mean, to me, it's just such a spirit of entrepreneurship. It's got so many great businesses. And obviously that, kind of ceiling of how do you break, you got a handful of global companies, and then you've just got, an army of smaller companies that really just want to break to the next level if it really just wasn't for the regulatory structure and the environment. So again, it's a bittersweet knowing that, to me, Italy could just be punching so much higher. And culturally, of course, it's hard to think of a country in the U.S. that has more cultural relevance than Italy. It's not just that, I think it's third or fourth largest ethnicity in terms of background in the United States, but it's also just such embedded in our culture in a way. Like the best example of this is, I believe German is the second most common ethnicity in the United States, but you'll never find anybody who speaks a word of German. Yeah, sure, we're going to enjoy a hamburger, but I've never taken to sauerkraut. The point being is like the cultural relevance. Everybody, I guess it could be flip it and say everybody enjoys pizza and spaghetti, but it goes deeper than that. I mean, everybody, at least of my generation, I mean, I remember, when I was about your age in my 20s and going to an event and there was Sophia Loren in the room, and you're just like, oh, and again, you don't need to have known all of her movies to know who she is and know the impact on American and global culture. And so to me, the Italians are just amazing on culture and they're amazing on certain aspects of the business community. And I really do think there's an opportunity to level up other parts of the society and the economy in the same way. So I'm cautiously optimistic. Obviously, we're very excited about the current leadership in Italy, which, might be starting to set a record for longevity, or at least in modern history.
Yeah. And going back to you, so you have the Medici blood flowing through your veins, but I'm wondering kind of what sparked your interest in, you've had such an interesting career. What sparked the interest at the start when you're at university to go into sort of policy and public service, economics? I mean,
Yeah,
love to
and
know.
so both of my parents, and in fact, my parents met serving together in the Navy here in the U.S., and so there's always been a sense of public service. My mother, I mean, I should say that both of my parents are accountants. Maybe that comes from the Medici side. I don't know. Not only did we, I guess, inspire double entry book counting, maybe we and they had to learn how to practice it down the line. But both my parents have worked in and out of government, mostly at the state and local level. So my mother worked in county government here for a very long time. I've had, my lots of members of my family have served. My sister was in the army for a considerable amount of time. So there's always been a sense of public service. There's always been, but there's also mixed with that kind of special Southern Italian skepticism of government. You believe in I mean, it is a really weird mix. You could correct me whether you think I'm off on this, but I think there's a particular unique Southern Italian real sense of community and public service, but also just deep skepticism of government functioning at the same time. So it's like, okay, I'm going to try this. I'm going to be cautious about it. I'm not really ever going to fully trust it. But, the community, the family, all of those things are central, and that comes first. And I do think that there's, a terrific aspect of that and it is interesting to me how much again, I think there's a distinctly Southern Italian view. I'm trying to remember, there's a great passage from, Barzini's 60s book, book he wrote in the 60s called The Italians, where he sort of talks about the Southern attitude as, you kind of government is something done to you. You have a succession of rulers, whether it's the Bourbons, I mean, whoever, and they just come in, you find a way to navigate it. And sooner or later they go away and the next ones come in, or it's the church, and it's always something that's oppressed upon you. And so it's one reason why, again, I've always had such an interest in that part of the world. And I do think that there's a fundamentally, very different view, between the North and the South in Italy and my own probably political philosophy, if you will. But interestingly enough, not only is that the only connection, so I did my PhD at George Mason University and had the ability to study with James Buchanan, who of course won the Nobel in '86 for his work on public choice. I think what is not as recognized is so much of the seeds of public choice were really Buchanan's time in Italy, his doctoral time in Italy. And he really, in many places, he came here very fluent in Italian and read a lot of the classic, not just Pareto, but a lot of the classic Italian public finance literature of the late 1800s. And that really, I mean, and he's been very open about this in spots, and that really was the inspiration for a lot of public choice theory was Italian public finance theory. And so a lot of the roots of it really go back to his time in Italy. And again, I think he was always, even when I took a class with him, always very open about that. So all of that body of work really does trace it. And unfortunately, I mean, because so little of it, I think, has actually been translated. But I would go as far to say, again, with the other than the big names like Pareto, I think that body of late 1800s Italian public finance literature has unfortunately largely been forgotten. But it really is a precursor to modern political economy, public choice theory.
And looking back at your career, like whether it be the US-Japan economic dialogue and your role there, or with the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement? Like, what are some of the key highlights
Well,
in your view, and the
also
lessons?
meant to add a sort of important wrinkle in that, I finished undergrad in the early 90s, which when in the US really was the phrase jobless recovery first came about. And it was the aftermath of the savings and loan crisis. And one of the reasons I went to graduate school was because the overall job market was so weak. And there has been this element of, boom and bust in the financial markets, housing markets, really did constrain and shape my life choices. And it's certainly been a thread mostly at times I'd say unconscious where the overall macroeconomic environment and the financial regulatory environment shaped my career choices, not simply in what I studied and looked at, but what my options were. And it's really always impressed upon me the importance of cohort effects and the time we all are creatures of our time to some extent. And obviously I'm not taking away agency, but again, just to me it's stuck with me, and it's also stuck with my approach to being a regulator, which I know we'll talk about a little bit. Because when you are going to college and what's in the news are empty office buildings in Boston and Dallas and failed savings and loans by the hundred, it kind of sticks with you. And it's just like you hear the old stories about people who grew up or came of age in the 1930s and would never put their money in the stock market again. And so for me, there's always been this sense of financial crises happen, booms and busts happen. So whenever I hear people kind of make comments about, well, business cycles don't die of old age, I'm like, well, they seem to die of something. And even if they don't, there seems to be, a fair amount of cyclicality, at least the United States. So to me, it's always kind of had this hope for the best, but plan for the worst approach. And so, but again, as you mentioned, I spent my time 2017, 2018 at the White House working on tax and trade issues. So it's part of the team that helped put together the 2017 tax reform. And, honestly, what probably to me, the most important thing out of it was the reduction in corporate rates, which I appreciate, maybe the least politically appreciated, because obviously there's a degree to which the general public doesn't necessarily see corporations as pass-throughs. I mean, economists, we can debate what percent of the corporate tax burden is borne by employees, but generally, as economists, we accept that some percent of the corporate tax burden is borne by employees, and obviously some of it by shareholders. But the fundamental issue of a corporation is essentially a pass-through, and the economic burden, the taxation is borne by the constituent components between capital and labor. We all get that. Again, debates about the matter degree are important. And I thought the reduction in corporate tax rates, of course, maybe I should have said from my mother's side, had more sympathy for Ireland. But our desire to make the U.S. more internationally competitive on the domestic side, on the international side with taxation, I think was critical. And that's the most important. There were other aspects of tax reform that I think were extremely important for growth, labor force participation. But again, we had seen such weak productivity coming out of the great financial crisis that to me, we had to come up with a set of policies that could address that. And I would really, to maybe boil it all down, I really looked at what we were doing during my time at the White House as fundamentally trying to move two levers: increasing productivity and increasing labor force participation. And a lot of what we were doing was flowing through that. On the trade side, there was certainly some connection to that, but it was also fundamentally about trying to, open up our trading partners. So for very good and understandable reasons, post World War II environment, the U.S. really was the dominant international trading partner. And we really weren't, necessarily threatened from imports from the rest of the world. In fact, we were basically exporting everywhere. And so you had a system, except of course, where we forced the Brits to give up their colonial trading privileges and get rid of it, let go of India and other aspects of that. But by and large, we opened up our markets, in my opinion, in a sort of asymmetric manner. And the best example of this, and as you mentioned, I worked on Japan trade issues. we in the 40s and 50s didn't want a military dictatorship or risk that to come back to Japan. So one of the aspects of that was opening up U.S. markets to Japanese goods, but not really demanding that Japan open up its markets. And I mean, anybody who has dealt with the Japanese economy knows it's a very closed domestic economy. They're great international competitors, but it's very tough to get into Japan and compete. And it's almost unfortunate that so much of the conversation, you know, rotates around tariffs, because I would go as far to say I find tariffs the least interesting part of trade policy. Much more interesting questions, and maybe a great one, since we've been on the Italy topic, is you know, can there be Parmesan cheese that comes from Wisconsin? I would the answer is where you sit, right? Are these geographic indicators are obviously in Europe just so important. We can debate the difference between Champagne and Prosecco sometime, but there is just such an importance, and some of them are cultural, and some of them are very legitimate, and some of them are and some of them are just naked trade barriers. And then there are also, so for instance, one of the funniest to me meetings I had with the Japanese trade representatives at one point was suggesting to them that they increase their quota on rice into U.S. rice in Japan. And the response was that Japanese people couldn't digest American rice. And so it's like you got to be kidding me. But but ultimately, we were successful at getting them to increase the quota with the caveat that it could only be used for feedstock. So I learned that Japanese animals can eat American rice, but Japanese people cannot. So but you really kind of, these non-tariff trade barriers to me are the biggest aspects. They're far more important in my mind than tariffs, because they're just more opaque, and they hide behind a lot of rationale and a lot of reasoning. Um, and again, because they have a grain of truth. I mean, every country certainly has a reasonable expectation on safety standards for food and imports. And obviously a number of countries um, may have practices that bar certain foods from coming in for health and safety standards, and there's a reasonable element of that. But obviously, there are many instances where it's simply used as a trade barrier. So again, there's some nuances there. And again, probably the biggest, and one of the things I worked on the Mexico-Canada trade deal, and I think one of the things that's not talked about enough that I think was one of the most important chapters were the digital trade. And obviously, a lot of dispute today, and has been going between the U.S. and Europe on digital trade issues and digital tax issues. And I do think we're at a pivot point where we kind of have to ask ourselves, is the future of trade still going to be, autos and airplanes, or is it going to be, digital services, financial services? What do we think it's going to be going forward? And certainly in the past, it's stunning to the degree, as I always say, historically, trade is basically the three A's of autos, airplanes, and agriculture. And it's just sort of stunning. I'm sure we could talk for hours about Boeing versus Airbus, but that's a whole different rabbit hole. And so the point being is, to me, I do think we're at a pivot point where it's important to lay the ground rules for moving beyond what has trade and what has historically been just goods and more about professional services, but particularly on the digital side. And obviously, there's a bit of self-interest because the U.S. today does dominate in digital services. And again, I think the world's going to be more competitive in digital services, but there's a real threat that simply gets taxed heavily and regulated heavily. And obviously, some of the European treatment of information technology. And I would say it doesn't really matter to some degree what the U.S. administration is going to be. Whoever's in the White House, there's going to be a degree of feeling like that Europe is stepping on our tech companies. And so that's always going to be an issue. And that was, interestingly enough, again, that was to me an important chapter, even though we don't really have a lot of tension with Canada and Mexico on digital trade issues. But for those kind of thinking about this in Europe from a trade aspect, a lot of the chapters in USMCA were meant to be plug and play. They were meant to be crafted out between US, Mexico, and Canada, and then later inserted in other trade deals. So maybe the best example of this is the chapter on state-owned enterprises. And the only one of any relevance with Mexico is obviously Pemex in the energy sector. but it really was meant to be a framework with how we ultimately deal with Chinese state-owned enterprises and perhaps how we deal with state-owned enterprises in Europe. And so for those who really want to wonder, what would a US-UK trade deal look like? What would a US-EU trade deal look like? I would go back to USMCA. I would look at the digital trade chapter. I would look at the professional services, the financial services. I would look at the state-owned enterprise chapter. Those would be really the starting point of the U.S. And our incoming, if he is confirmed, and I think he will be, our incoming USTR, Jameson Greer, worked on USMCA. He was a big part of these deals, and I don't speak for him, but I do think his starting point is really going to go back to USMCA as a framework. So I know we didn't necessarily going to want to go too far down the trade rabbit hole, but there are some interesting aspects there that I think will keep all of us occupied the next few years.
That's really interesting. I would love to come back to trade and also kind of your view of the next 4 years on this topic. Before we do, just reflecting again on your career, your time in the White House, your time working on all these different issues. You worked with Secretary Mnuchin. If I'm not mistaken, you're also involved in the vetting of, Ben
Oh
Bernanke
yeah,
and
exactly.
some, some really key figures, from people like me that were reading about 2008 in the history books because we're too young. I mean,
I do feel like it's been a bit of a fortunate ride. So I spent 8 years on the Senate Banking Committee, first with fellow economist Phil Gramm and then Richard Shelby as chairs. And so the Federal Reserve, as well as the Council of Economic Advisors, the CEA nominations, all go through the Banking Committee. So I worked on 3 Bernanke nominations, one for CEA and 2 for the Fed. And again, that ability to kind of be there and craft the questions for the senators, engage with the nominees, certainly helped when I was myself a nominee before that committee, having worked on a number of nominations before that committee. And it is, I think it's an unrecognized difference between the Senate and the House. Because the Senate handles nominations, you end up building a relationship with the nominee during that process that usually sticks to some degree once they're confirmed, that House members don't start with. So there's always kind of a sense, especially, if you're a controversial nominee or, maybe if you're not a big name, but even a big name, I mean, even someone like Ben Bernanke, you're going to have a senator or two who takes a particular interest and usually helps you understand the process. Because I mean, you could be a Nobel laureate. Doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to understand the Senate confirmation process, which is full of nuances, and some of which, can throw you aside. As you might remember, Peter Diamond won the Nobel during his confirmation process and never got confirmed. So even having a Nobel is not enough to necessarily get you across the finish line. There are other reasons that may be outstanding. And I suspect that Peter Diamond's not the first Nobel to not get confirmed. But again, understanding that process, understanding the nuances, and you don't necessarily see it in a book. But again, to me, it was very helpful in getting to know many of these people, building relationships that later, came in very helpful, and getting to understand them, because it's one of the rare opportunities where they definitely feel like they need to answer questions. It's like, they're going to take their time because they want to get confirmed. And the smart ones understand that even if they're meeting with committee staff, of which I was, that it's in their interest to answer questions. It's in their interest to try to be transparent about what they think. And so again, that was a interesting process. Again, I think the last nomination I worked on before I left the Hill was Austin Goosby's CEA nomination, was the last one I worked on before I went to CATO from the banking committee. But I was also at the banking committee leading up to and during 2008. So in the years preceding, it really took us. We started doing Fannie and Freddie reform in 2003. We actually worked on rating agency reform before the crisis. Didn't quite get all of those things done. But it's to some extent, I'm trying to remember who this was. I remember I was at a conference, and I think it was Charlie Calamaris at Columbia was presenting a paper on his views. And this was, 2010, 2011, of the contributors to the crisis. And I remember immediately after the paper thinking, wow, all that was stuff we actually tried to fix before the crisis, and we just couldn't get it across the finish line. We couldn't build a political consensus for it. So I felt like that both Senator Shelby, who I worked for, as well as the staff I worked with, most of the problems we identified, and ultimately the inability and that frustration of being able to build a political consensus to get it passed in the law, was part of the problem. So, yes, there are obviously surprises and nuances with every recession and crisis, but it's stunning to me how often commonalities come back and forth, that continue. And it's actually would go back and say, my interest in the history of sort of Italian banking has, you see a lot of these problems today that you would have seen in Genoa in the 1400s, if you will, that, with the history of state banking in Europe, or the problems with the Medicis, or a good theme that you can always take for financial crisis is that most of history, it's really problems where, the sovereign essentially gives you some sort of quasi monopoly in exchange for lending to them, and then they eventually default and the bank gets in trouble. That's most of European, financial history, at least, and has some relevancy even today in terms of, Greek and Italian banking, in the Euro crisis. So these connections, again, this is why to me, I really have been very heavily influenced by the Italian way of thinking, because rather than, modern econ where we sort of maybe take a diamond to big viewpoint and you've got a very stylized mathematical model, it's impossible, in my view, to come from this history of Italian public finance and this history of Italian banking and not see the political fiscal aspects of the sovereign wed with the banking system. The banking, particularly in Europe, even more so in the US, is inherently political. And again, it means very different things. It's often one reason, and I don't know that I think people in Europe appreciate this as much. With maybe slight exaggeration, it's almost a default in Europe that if you have one or two national champion banks, that you rescue them without really any debate. I don't think I'm exaggerating or describing that unfairly. Whereas the U.S., there's a lot of animosity, and again, perhaps it's just a difference in how the political systems filter preferences. But the bank rescues in the U.S., whether it was 2008 or even, recently Silicon Valley Bank, none of those things were popular, and they were largely, if you polled the public or took a referendum, they would have failed. And it really was an instance of where, the institutional players installed their own preferences, counter to probably where the overall public preferences were. So I guess I don't want to make assumptions about the European population's preferences, but certainly, and this is a good point for people like myself to always remember, which is, probably 80% of who Americans, certainly in policy making positions, engage with in Europe are going to, by definition, be part of the European elite. And how much does that represent, the European public? I remember several years ago, my first trip to Japan, and at that time there was a lot of tensions because of the military footprint in Osaka and some of the problems with engaging with the local population. And if you talk to officials in Tokyo, they were like, "Oh, ignore that. It's all just anti-Tokyo feeling." I mean, their view was extremely different from what population was in Osaka. And again, it's just an example and again a way to remind us that yes, you have to engage, and by definition, as a policymaker, you are going to be engaging across the table with elite policymakers. But they may or may not necessarily be fully representative of where the population is in their countries, and obviously they have their own politics to navigate. I think we in the U.S. tend to be much more closely tied to swings in public perception. And obviously Italy's also a case because as quickly as you go through governments, it's certainly tied to the population in a way where, I would probably argue that France is not, or at least maybe France is becoming more responsive to populist concerns. But again, these things really do enter into conversations about policy.
And now moving on to Fannie and Freddie, and also, your role as head of the FHFA. But I suppose before we get into that, because I'd love to really discuss now, because I heard you speak on the big picture, both pre-election now and post-election and your thoughts. I'd love to kind of expand upon this, but maybe just to give our university listeners a bit of context, could you kind of explain maybe your role in the creation of the
Sure,
FHFA and then
absolutely.
also how Fannie and Freddie have changed since '08 and until now, and then also 2012, the net worth sweep. Maybe if you could give like a bit of
Absolutely,
context.
absolutely. Let me try to do this as concise as possible, but as comprehensive as possible. So Fannie and Freddie are federally, congressionally chartered, basically finance companies that have their charters from Congress. They are the Federal Housing Finance Agency is their current regulator, which I helped create when I was working in Capitol Hill and drafted a lot of the legislation that created that agency in 2008. We started working on creating a new agency in 2003 in the aftermath of the accounting scandals. So you may remember there were accounting scandals at Fannie and Freddie, manipulations of earnings. Again, I think Fannie was the largest restatement next after WorldCom. So, and Freddie's accounting standards. Actually, we found out about it because when Enron failed and Arthur Andersen essentially failed, Arthur Andersen was Freddie Mac's auditor. And then when Arthur Andersen failed, Freddie Mac got a new auditor and they wouldn't approve a whole host of their auditing. So that's how we initially found out about the accounting scandals was the change in auditor, which is interesting being only a couple of years after Sarbanes-Oxley. And I was also on the banking committee when Sarbanes-Oxley passed with a whole different set of issues. But in some sense, this does come back to the accounting scandals of Enron and WorldCom. And Fannie and Freddie were very much, in that camp. And we really walked away from the 2003 accounting scandals with feeling like the current regulator at the time called FHFA, or the Office of Federal Housing Enterprise Oversight, really wasn't up to the job. So the real implication in the 2000s was not to recreate Fannie and Freddie, but to recreate their regulator, to give their regulator the resources and authorities that we thought it would need to avoid problems. So Fannie and Freddie were largely same charter and they, and same footprint and activities as they were pre-2008. But again, it was an increase in the power of the regulator. And as it happened to be, the regulator was created in July 2008, and then in September 2008, Fannie and Freddie were essentially insolvent and taken into conservatorship. And it's best to think of conservatorship as really just an administrative bankruptcy. I mean, that's the point of it, is to reorganize and rehabilitate the companies. And the primary difference is instead of a bankruptcy judge, you have a conservator who's a government appointee. And it's really modeled on the FDIC model. And in fact, I always remind people when we were designing the statute, we literally, if you want to be ungenerous, you could say we plagiarized the Federal Deposit Insurance Act, but we essentially marked up the Federal Deposit Insurance Act and used that as the model for Fannie and Freddie, making whatever modifications. So I really think it's important for people to understand that the current context of Fannie and Freddie conservatorship really is the FDIC model. That's what was established. That was what was intended to be used. There was also receiverships provisions created in 2008 that were not used, that in my opinion probably should have been used. And these were very similar to what eventually became Title II of Dodd-Frank, the Orderly Resolution Authority. And so if you think about the differences, a conservatorship is a reorganization where a receivership may be a partial reorganization, liquidation, where you've got more authorities to, essentially cram down creditors and reorganize. But the point of either of these resolution frameworks is to get the failed insolvent company back in a stable financial shape. And that was the intent of what was done in 2008. And again, that's what the intent of Title II and Dodd-Frank is. And again, it was meant to have a administrative resolution mechanism where you could move very quickly with the intent of how do you keep critical facilities going? And this is the important difference, I think, between large financial institutions and say, large companies in general. Although obviously, we can debate, how systemically important are airlines. We seem to rescue them pretty regularly. But the point being is part of the way you want to design and think about resolution of a Fannie Mae or a Citibank or a Deutsche Bank is to think about what are the critical facilities that they perform that you keep operating during a resolution. So how do you resolve these entities where you're imposing losses on creditors, where you're wiping out shareholders, but you're keeping the critical facilities and function of the companies operating so that you're not disrupting the economy. And so again, this is not a pull it apart, shut it down. It is a, how do you keep the important parts going? And so that was what was created in 2008. Again, Fannie and Freddie became insolvent in 2008. They were taken into conservatorship with the purpose of ultimately trying to fix them. And again, this was done under the Bush administration when Hank Paulson was Treasury Secretary. Obviously, it wasn't there long thereafter that President Obama won, brought in former New York Fed President Tim Geithner as Treasury Secretary, and they took a very different view, and in some ways good, in some ways bad. I mean, it's actually kind of stunning to look back and remember that President Obama gave speeches saying that Fannie and Freddie need to go away. They, failed companies. We should shut them down. We should have a new model. But at the same time that these statements were made, you essentially had an approach by Secretary Geithner that kind of froze them in amber, if you will. There were backstops of creditors. Eventually, in 2012, when Secretary Geithner was about to leave the Treasury, they created what was called the net worth sweep. And what was essentially done with the net worth sweep, or the Third Amendment to the underlying share agreements, was in exchange for creating a quasi line of credit, you would sweep all the profits. And so you were obviously, on one hand, boxing the companies in where they could never build capital and get back out, which, in my opinion, is counter to what you're supposed to be achieving as a conservator. But it really was meant to, the Obama administration's approach was, we don't ever want these companies to get out of conservatorship. And I believe that their intention was to say, if we lock these companies in conservatorship, that will force Congress to come in and fix the situation, which in their mind meant creating an explicit government guarantee of GSE debt. Now, since Congress is unwilling to do that, for perhaps the obvious reason of not wanting to say add $7 trillion to the national debt and take on these liabilities. Plus, there is a fair amount of disagreement. I do think, particularly on the Republican side of the aisle, there is still a considerable hostility to saying, why would we want to put a government guarantee behind these companies? And so you went through this time where essentially the Obama administration had locked in the status quo, this limbo, without having an end game. The regulator at that time was an independent regulator with a term appointment. And so when President Trump won, and I went to the White House in 2017 as chief economist of the vice president, we had the Obama regulator was still with us for 2 years because of the term appointment. So we were not able to take control, if you will, of FHFA until 2019. At which point, we began the process of saying, for right or wrong, the law is you fix them and you get them out. And we also spent a fair amount of time. I mean, Secretary Mnuchin had said to me right after I got appointed that, we're going to go to the Hill and we're going to get Congress to fix this. And of course, I had been through a couple of rounds of this before. So I said to the secretary, I don't think that's going to happen, but I'll go up there with you and I'll do the meetings and I'll make the pitch and I'll help out any way I can. And I think about 8 months later, he finally concluded, yeah, Congress isn't going to fix this. It's on us. And I think probably a new administration will come in and relearn that. There's often a lot of optimism with any new administration on what you think you can get Congress to do. And it often turns out to be a lot tougher to get Congress to fix what you perceive are problems than you think. So all that said, there were multiple efforts. There were even efforts in the Obama years to restructure Fannie and Freddie and Congress. They never really got, momentum. And so, maybe there's a 10% chance of a crisis. Congress would come in and revisit these issues in a real, substantive way. But I think at this point, you have to kind of assume we're stuck with the Fannie and Freddies we have, in terms of charter, in terms of activities, and the regulator we have. So what do you do? And my view is fundamentally you follow the law, you fix them. I do think, and perhaps I'm certainly not unbiased, having created the regulator, had a hand in creating it rather, and creating the authorities. There are certainly additional authorities and powers I would give the regulator, but my view is you have about 85% of what you need. We promulgated what I thought was a good capital rule, and the abstract, Would have loved it to see it be stronger, but at the end of the day, getting strong capital rules in place for any financial institution is tough. But I thought we got into a good place. We were working on liquidity rules. We, had created living wills for the GSEs so that if did need to be a resolution in the future, we were doing resolution planning. I quite frankly thought we got to a place that, had you had an insolvent GSE again, you could have resolved it without taxpayer assistance. Whether you have the will to do that is a secondary question. But we were fixing, I think, a lot of the underlying problems with the GSEs. I think part of my frustration coming in was there really hadn't, despite over a decade of conservatorship, there really hadn't been a lot of effort to fix the fundamentals of the companies. We were undergoing considerable corporate culture efforts, for instance, and culture is an important part of this. I would go as far to say, Fannie and Freddie did not have the kind of culture you'd want to see at a large, highly regulated financial company. It was almost sort of the worst of government, the worst of the private sector combined. And so we really needed, it wasn't simply just the formal rules of getting capital right. It was the informal, how do you get these companies to have the perspective and to accept the responsibilities that they had and to think in a manner of how you would want these to function. Maybe in my more my light moments as director, I would say to the staff that my objective was to have Fannie Mae only be as highly leveraged, mismanaged, and poorly regulated as Citibank. Modest goals, modest goals. But but in more seriousness, our objective was to essentially, like just like one can debate what you do with the implied guarantee behind Fannie and Freddie debate in the same way that we can debate what do you do with the implied guarantee in the $1 trillion of uninsured deposits that Citibank has. I mean, what is the right solution? And so the point being, and this really was the core objective of the legislation we passed in 2008, was simply to get Fannie and Freddie to be no worse or no better than any other large financial company. That's what, again, to me, modest, achievable goals that, we're not going to fix everything wrong with Citi or Wells Fargo, and we're not going to fix everything with Fannie, but how do we get some commonality? How do we get a level playing field essentially between those entities? And that was the objective. And it really was to take what was a really well-known bank regulatory structure. People often debate, since you regulate them as insurance companies, well, Congress decided you're going to regulate them largely as banks. And that's what we were putting in place, partly because that's what federal regulators generally understand, at least understand to a degree. And here we are today. Fannie and Freddie are still in conservatorship since 2008. We've made, in some areas, tremendous improvements. So when I took over as director, Fannie and Freddie were leveraged 1,000 to 1. Fair to say, strong wind will blow you over at that kind of leverage. Today, they're probably about 60 to 1, so considerable progress building capital. There's still considerable amount of way to go. We were also de-risking in a number of areas. Some of that's been reversed, but some of that will come back. And so I think there'll be a real interest in the incoming administration to essentially follow the law in this area. It's not a quick activity. So, for people who are interested in the timing, you're not going to see an exit from conservatorship in 2025. There's simply just too much to do. It'll take you 6-7 months to get a new FHFA director. Any Treasury secretary is going to be more focused on taxes and tariffs and sanctions and other issues than they are on GSE exit. But ultimately, we spent a lot of money with Wall Street advisors. I paid a lot of people's bonuses, probably indirectly, back in 2019, 2020. And we did a lot of work. And the point is, there's a lot on the shelf. We really went through the decision trees and almost all of the questions you really want to answer to do what could be the largest public offerings ever. So, you really are going to market of a considerable size. Obviously, that number has shrunk since what we were planning to do in 2020. But again, getting there, it's doable. I mean, the mechanics to me aren't even really in question. It's a question of, do you have the political will? Do the overall market, do the equity markets and the housing markets cooperate? This will be much harder to do politically if we're in a downturn of any sort, or if mortgage rates go up. So there are certainly political ramifications. And of course, ultimately, the job of the conservator really is to, regulator conservator is to lay a pathwork for Fannie and Freddie to get themselves out. So I do want to emphasize, I think a lot of people look at this as government to fix it. Ultimately, it really is the plan is to give Fannie and Freddie the ability to fix themselves. So this is really a lot's going to rely on what the companies do. Certainly, there'll be questions about, is this the executive team in either company? Is this the boards you need to take charge and to get these companies out? So that'll take 6-month review process. But ultimately, what you can do really is create mile markers, give the companies a map, but they're the one who've got to get in the car and drive the distance.
And looking, I'd love to look at some of the different, because you said you've explored all the different possible scenarios which an exit would take, but I would love to look at that, but also with your views now, knowing the post-election results, knowing how big the victory has been, and now we have Scott Bessent, who's been proposed as the Treasury Secretary, and also your views on Doge and how that would affect the exit from conservatorship, based on these two pieces of information.
Well, let's start with the easy one, Doge. And I'm trying, and I'm gonna remain cautiously, optimistic. I've seen a lot of efforts at government reform and budget reform in the past, and so I'm trying to be, again, keep my expectations aligned, but maintain that optimism. As I've heard a couple of people say in reference to Elon, never underestimate a man who can parallel park a rocket. This guy gets some crazy stuff done, and if anybody can get things across the finish line, it may well be Elon. And obviously Vivek is these are just two tremendously stubborn and talented individuals who you shouldn't underestimate. But this is Washington, and everything is intentionally hard in Washington. That's the way our founding fathers designed it. And so it's important to keep remember that Doge essentially is going to be giving recommendations. Some category of recommendations will be to Congress. Some category will be to the president, so the things you could do via executive order. And certainly there is a bully pulpit role to this as well. And so, to the degree to which Doge can focus on, yes, we should end the conservatorships. And, obviously there's a broad theme within Doge of, are there government services that we should privatize that involved in? And so I do want to emphasize, because to me, sometimes the words often matter. Fannie and Freddie never stopped being private. They're just in a resolution mechanism and they're still by law considered private companies. But to exit them from conservatorship, I certainly see as part of a broader, reprivatization, privatization bent, which is certainly consistent. If we're going to, as a country, ask China to, discipline its state-owned enterprises and ask Europe to discipline its quasi-state-owned enterprises, then I think we need to discipline our own state-owned enterprises, in which Fannie and Freddie are probably the most prominent. And how do we, again, move toward a level playing field? So I certainly see an exit from conservatorship is fully consistent with the underlying principles and philosophy of Doge. But I also recognize they're going to be touching 100 different things. Whether this is going to be a top five for Doge is remains to be seen. I will suspect it will be mentioned. But again, how much energy is put in this particular issue from Doge, I think it's too early to say.
So maybe not top five, but top 10. Is this something which?
Maybe.
Yeah.
I mean, there's
Just
a
go.
lot of things to focus on, and I expect it to be mentioned. I expect it to be helpful in building momentum. But you're really going to see Doge just focus on a significant number of issues. And I think the problem or the issue that they're going to have is, if you come up with 100 suggestions, you might as well have no suggestions. I mean, but you have to focus. My view would be, if Doge is going to be successful, you got 3 or 4 big things you can really drill down on. And if you can get those accomplished, you'll be lucky.
And going back to your timeline on the exit for conservatorship, how does that look like now under this next president? And you said sort of there's maybe a 70% chance by 2027. Could you kind of expand more
Sure.
upon
And let me say, no,
how this
again, I
happens?
want to be clear that I don't speak for the incoming administration, but I do think there's a general inclination to get FHFA back toward essentially fulfilling its statutory mandate as conservator. And part of this is really a very general philosophy. So even when I was at the administration last time, you really saw this shift, particularly at the White House and OMB, the Office of Management Budget, where the expectation and pressure on the agencies really was, and this was before the Chevron change in the Supreme Court, but it was essentially how do we get to a world where we narrow the scope of agency discretion away from, a pre-Chevron world really allowed agencies to basically say, courts look at it and say, well, that interpretation, it's kind of in the ballpark. You could make that argument, we'll let it go. Whereas, what we're seeing in the post-Chevron world, which I want to emphasize that 19 and 20, the Trump White House was already kind of operating in a post-Chevron world by saying that agency rules coming over have to essentially be the best and most reasonable read of the statute, not any plausible read of the statute. And so an exit from conservatorship is the best and it is the best and only real reasonable read of the statute. So I know that both the Obama and the Biden administrations have kind of taken a view of, conservatorship allows you to step into the shoes of the shareholders, therefore you can do anything you want. Well, of course, that's not the purpose of a conservatorship. I kind of maybe a parallel, when the rental car company Hertz failed in 2020, it went into a bankruptcy court, where the equivalent of what the Biden folks did was to say, if the bankruptcy judge had said, you know what, electric vehicles are the future, and you, Hertz, during bankruptcy can only buy electric vehicles. And I think you and I would sit here and say, that may or may not be good policy, but how is that the role of a bankruptcy judge? And so you've seen a number of initiatives pursued by the Biden administration under conservatorship, which have nothing to do with being a conservator. And so again, this is just a cross-cutting theme, not just at FHFA, but pretty much at every agency, where I think the Trump administration perspective is going to be agencies are expected to follow the clear reading of the law and not to get, not to make up or get creative or try to find ways around it. And I don't really think people outside of government truly appreciate, having been in government for a number of years, the general attitude is, how can we do what we want to do and come up with an ex post rationalization where it's not too laughable read of the law, but it's certainly not a fidelity to the plain language of the law. And so again, that's the fundamental shift, and you're going to see that across every agency, but even including FHFA. And again, the importance here is that there really is no other best reasonable read of the law other than you fix them and get them out. And so you're going to see. So this is why I would say, and even though I, again, don't speak for the administration, the view is going to be you're going to see far more consistency with the underlying statute. And that's why I think you're going to see some effort at exit. But again, lots of things can go wrong. As I said, the macroeconomic, the housing environment can change. We've already started to see some weakness, in the labor markets. And if you see the job market fall off a cliff, which I don't think is going to happen, but you do have to think about the tail risk. So to me, 70%, that leaves you 30% it doesn't happen because there is a significant risk that things go wrong or the companies themselves aren't where they need to be. So for instance, Fannie and Freddie, it wasn't until 2008 that Fannie and Freddie were required filers under our securities law. So you think about, and they've been in conservatorship that whole time. So let me put it this way, and to go back to the earlier part of the conversation with my parents and my own accounting background, if you're going to do the largest public offerings in history, you certainly want the accounting to be solid. And I'm not convinced it is. So, but but the takeaway really should be there are a number of problems facing these companies, all of which are solvable. It's really just a matter of commitment to solving them. Maybe you got to throw a lot of money at it. Maybe you got to throw a lot of resources at it, but it's not insurmountable. It's really just the will to do it, the focus to do it. And so a lot of this is really going to depend on, when do you get a permanent FHFA director and who is that person? My guess is, on one hand, to remind you, not only was Secretary Mnuchin, his affiliation with One West, former Indian Mac Bank, but he was an MBS trader at Goldman earlier in his career. So you probably have never had a Treasury Secretary as familiar with the mortgage market and the mortgage capital markets as Stephen Mnuchin. And so this is not a question of our incoming Treasury Secretary, but more a question of my guess is he staffs out and brings some people in. So, who do we see for Undersecretary for Domestic Finance? Is that someone with mortgage finance expertise? And those are the things to kind of look for. And I really don't think we have a good sense at this point. Mnuchin was legendary within, our circles internally for doing all of his own research. I mean, he didn't really staff out. He did it himself. The guy, he was a round the clock worker who read tons, stacks of paper and would be the most brief guy in the room. But it also meant that, there were going to be bottlenecks. And on one hand, you knew if Treasury approved it that Stephen Mnuchin himself had read it and understood it. But it also meant that you weren't going to get it approved until he had read it and understood it. So it cuts both ways. But my point being is I think it's really too early to tell whether, how much the incoming Treasury Secretary is going to delegate these issues, what his own interest and role is going to be. But I would say in 5 or 6 months, we'll know. So some of this, again, is still evolving. And this is why I say directionally, you're looking at about a 70% chance of being ready for the companies to exit if the companies have gotten themselves ready. And again, the momentum is there, but of course, there's lots of things that can go sideways.
And then looking at sort of the impact for the investors, because I think this has gained a lot of headlines. Who are the top supporters of Trump? John Paulson, Bill Ackman are two to name,
So
and they
let me,
obviously.
I mean, and again, our approach certainly in when I was at FHFA, and I think it's going to be approached this way, is that whatever happens to investors is purely incidental. I mean, you're not trying to reward them, you're not trying to punish them. The balance sheets are the balance sheets. The value on the balance sheets are the value of the assets. And so certainly, you know, I kind of look at it this way, and you've got some funny accounting. You've got these huge negative retained earnings that kind of make the balance sheets balance. But conceptually, the way to think about it is, assets are here, liabilities are here. You need to bring those into conformity. And there will be some, if you will, shared nominal sacrifice. There's not going to be any real sacrifice because the nominal value of the liabilities simply isn't real. It doesn't match the real value. So you have to have a process where the nominal value of the liabilities is going to actually match the economic value. And that's going to be some shared sacrifice, but it's certainly not going to be taken all by the taxpayer. And so it is important to keep in mind that I don't know of any scenario where, the American taxpayer doesn't own 90+% of the companies. And of course, you have to have a process, which we were going to put in place for the Treasury Department to sell off its own stake. But certainly, for the current shareholders, whether they're common or preferred, they're almost likely to get some part of the company. And of course, that may well be for them a good investment. But I do want to emphasize I was never part of any conversation, and there was never any view in my experience where we thought about, you know, rewarding again, either rewarding or punishing. It really was here the problem we have to solve. Let's fix it. Here's the existing law. Let's fix it. And again, I was an advocate of doing receivership in 2008, which would have wiped out all the equity holders. I think it would have just been a lot cleaner, and we wouldn't be, decade plus of litigation later, we would have a normal set of GSEs out there operating to the extent GSEs are ever normal. But all that said, there's got to be some interest, and we get that. But I think it's important to keep in mind that the investor interest is going to be probably more headline than actual what's going to drive the day-to-day process.
And then finally, on sort of the next 4 years, what are your views on the economy? Inner workings of the politics as well. Like, I'd love to get
I
your
think
view on.
I mean, since I'm not really even close to being unbiased, I will say, I'm fairly optimistic. One of the things that really struck me in 2017 when I first went to the White House, almost was enough to make me a hardcore Keynesian, was the amount of just animal spirits you would get from talking to CEOs. There really was a sense in 2017 where people would come in, especially we were doing these meetings on tax reform and other issues. And there really was this sense of people saying, it's safe for me to invest again. It's safe for me to hire again. And I was caught off guard how strong that feeling was with people. And I think you're really starting to see that view in the business sector of America, where people suddenly feel a lot more confident about what the business environment, the investment environment's going to be. So I do think you're going to see a bit of burst of animal spirits from the business side, from the consumer side. Now, again, there are softening in the labor market. We haven't completely beat inflation, so there are certainly, downside risks that are very real that you need to worry about. But I'm relatively optimistic about the direction. And one of, I think, the underappreciated things, because of course it was lots of little things in a sense adding up, but there was just such a significant amount. Go back to my earlier point about, our focus on productivity. There was such a focus on streamlining and deregulation with an eye toward productivity gains in 17, 18, and of course, in fact, the entire 4 years of the Trump administration. And I think there'll be a huge return. I mean, the fact that Russ Vought is coming back as OMB director, you really have an OMB director that is laser focused on how do you fix management issues in the federal government? How do you increase productivity? And so I think you're going to